All right, so in the interest of time, we'll go ahead and get going today. So today we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about 2023 State of Decarbonization in the industry. Before we get into the program, just real quick, couple of housekeeping items. One, anybody that signed up for the session today, whether they're able to attend or not, you will get a copy of the recording of the session probably within the 24 to 48 hour time frame. The second housekeeping item, if you have any questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A piece of the Zoom meeting, and please submit your questions that way. I'll keep an eye on the question and answers as time permits between our conversation, but we may have to defer the question and answer till the end of the session. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started here. So today we have myself, Lalit Agarwal, Vice President of Energy Management and Sustainability for EnergyCap. Been with the company about 2 years now, and love having the opportunity to assist a lot of energy and sustainability leaders from across the world achieve their energy and sustainability goals. And then I also have the privilege of co-presenting today with Connor with Verdantix. Connor, I'll let you introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much, Lalit. Hi, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be presenting this webinar with you today. I'm Connor. I'm a senior analyst at Verdantix. We're an independent market research and advisory firm, and I operate in the net zero and climate risk team. I've been in the industry for about half a decade now, and my research focuses on decarbonisation services, technology, corporate strategies, with a bit of carbon markets as well thrown in there. Before we get going, apologies for the COVID mugshot as well. I think I need to get that updated. But
I don't know. It looks pretty casual and nice, man. All right. Thanks, Connor, for introducing yourself. So we'll jump quickly into the agenda. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the regulatory landscape. Why are we even talking about decarbonization? What's driving this? Then Connor is going to do a service to all of us by talking through some of the data that Verdantix had gathered in terms of looking at a more macro picture of what the state of the market is. I'll then go into a little bit of details in a survey we did for decarbonization and where industry stands on it, and we'll dig into the key findings. And then we'll talk a little bit about how technology can help in that regard. So first, let's start with the regulatory landscape here. We probably all heard about this European Green Deal. This is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive that was passed earlier this year in 2023, which kind of builds on the Non-Financial Reporting Directive, also known as NFRD, which was published in 2014. Both of these directives required companies to report their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So there are some minor changes on how and who has to report the information. CSRD is becoming even more widespread, where it's increasing the requirement in a sense of who needs to report, and those details are available on the slide deck here. I'm not going to read through them. It's going to suddenly go from about 11,000 companies involved to more than 50,000 companies that will have to start submitting their data somewhere later in this decade, from 2024 to 2029. So that's a pretty big change when you look at Europe. Europe has been a little more on the forefront of sustainability and carbon reporting requirements. When you come back to the US also potentially has this federal SEC requirement that still is in a proposal stage, where they are trying to figure out any publicly traded companies, and they may have to report their emissions. The proposal is still debating whether or not it's just going to be scope 1 and scope 2, or potentially scope 3 also included in that. If you've been following the news, California just signed into law this month 2 bills, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, CCDAA, and the Climate Related Financial Risk Act, CRFRA, a mouthful, sorry, which requires a lot of companies that do business in California to also report their scope 1 and 2 and also scope 3 based on certain timelines that require the reporting of their carbon footprint. So in a sense, whether it's the European Union, whether it's the federal government, or even state governments like California, California claims to be the fourth largest economy in the world if it was a country by itself. So some of these big players, if you do business there, you are going to be required to do carbon accounting. But that's just not the governments. Even Amazon is trying to get into this, where they just, in their latest report on environmental and social initiatives, their VP just published this report, and they talk about how most people think of Amazon as the e-commerce company, but it's actually a much bigger undertaking. They are an entertainment studio, they are a cloud provider, grocer, which really makes sustainability a big priority for all of their business entities. And starting in 2024, Amazon is trying to actually require regular reporting and emission goal setting by those people that supply them their products that they turn around and provide to the consumers. So they are going to both use their innovation and their technologies to help enable their supply chain to provide them that information. And they're going to possibly consider giving preferential treatment to suppliers that are also allowing them to achieve their decarbonization vision. So even if it's not the government that's trying to tell you that you're going to be needing to identify, measure, and monitor your carbon footprint, it could be the businesses, because scope 3 includes those supply chain emissions. You will be required to probably engage in that. So the key there is, even if you don't fall under that 50,000 companies in Europe, or if you don't fall under any thresholds that SEC or even state of California is setting, odds are if you do business with these Fortune 500 companies that have their own sustainability goals and they are asking you to provide the sustainability data to them, you will probably need to figure out a way to support carbon reporting for your own supply chain. So that's at a very high level why we are talking about the state of decarbonization today. Connor, I'll ask you a quick question here. So what else are you seeing in addition to these big governmental initiatives? What else is driving this? And I can turn it over to the data that you have found through the Verdantix State of the Market.
Fantastic. Great question there. I guess before I should start diving into it, I'll quickly do my official disclaimer as an independent analyst. So we don't endorse any particular vendor, product, or service covered in our materials. And we disclaim all warranties expressed or implied with respect to this research. Now we can dive into the good stuff. I guess to answer your question, Lalit, we also had the same question at the beginning of this year. And although as analysts, we always have opinions on what's going on in the market, we think it's more compelling if you actually test those with real buyers, real participants. So at the beginning of the year, we undertook a survey of 350 heads of net zero, climate change, and ESG, representing a global respondent database from across industries, and focusing on mid-market all the way up to the very largest firms. To answer your question, Lalit, what we wanted to do is to really understand how climate change strategies are evolving. I think the topic of this webinar, Decarbonization 2023, is very pertinent to think where we've come from. When I first started, talking about this space, reporting and carbon management was still very much in its infancy. Firms doing CDP reports, firms just starting to think about, should I even disclose my emissions? This year, when we ask firms to describe what's the overarching aim of your climate change strategy, the predominant answer here was that 37% are seeking competitive advantage within our industry. What this tells me is it's quite clear that decarbonisation performance can be a commercial advantage. We were talking about Amazon earlier, the example of the supply chain. That's one element of this commercial advantage, being the most decarbonised provider within your industry. Another one is also, of course, shifting to provide products, services, which actually help decarbonize the industry. A good example of this is energy producers, right? Producing renewable energy. REX PPAs, they're in hot demand. So those are two different aspects to this. I won't talk too much about firms who are trying to achieve systemic change to global capitalism, a very lofty ambition. But I think there's still, a high majority of firms which are seeking to sort of understand and start their journey. We have 29% here who are looking to be aligned with stakeholder requirements, and a further 14% who are compliance focused. I think this also brings us back to this question of regulation and compliance. I think even when we asked this, the beginning of this year, end of last year, the compliance landscape was a lot less mature, and there was a lot less understanding of what the next few years were going to involve. Previously, when we ran the survey, the compliance requirements are actually not that hard. I mean, no one's going out there saying you need a net zero strategy or you need to disclose your transition plan, but that's shifting. So it'll be interesting to see how this data changes in the near future. Next slide, please, Lalit. So the way I try and frame this is by talking about net zero versus pure sort of carbon management or carbon reporting, as it was. One of the biggest changes that's happened in the past few years, sort of mirroring the emergence of the SBTI, the Science Based Targets Initiative, is this drive for businesses to show not only are we reporting on our emissions, not only do we understand our scope 1, 2, and 3, but that we ultimately have a strategy to reduce these to zero. And in a few instances, Microsoft, there's a few financial services firms out there, Apex Group, for example, to even become carbon negative. And this has radically changed the way that firms are managing decarbonisation. Previously, it was let's do some sort of voluntary report as part of our corporate social responsibility reporting. Now it's how can we gain business value from decarbonising? How can we participate in an economy which is hopefully aligned to a 1.5 degree warming scenario? Although if you guys read the IPCC, I think we might already have passed that. Funding, this has changed a lot. Previously, mostly coming from compliance-focused departments, or at least traditionally so, like EHS. These days, it's cross-functional, right? No longer is it just the EHS team, the sustainability team who are interested in this. It's operations, facilities, C-suite, finance, etc. Reporting, it's not just an annual sustainability report that people sort of tick a box and move on to it. Now it's going to be part of your mainstream financial filings. We mentioned the SEC earlier. In the UK, there's already mandatory TCFD regulation in the assured strategy report at the start of every single voluntary regulated report that UK listed firms have to do. And who's responsible for this? It's not just reporting focused teams now. With the emergence of the TCFD, governance structures are being put in place, ultimately headed by the board and C-suite, and potentially making them liable in a sort of Sarbanes-Oxley type manner for poor performance. Digital strategy. Previously, people used pre-existing tech stacks to manage this. Legacy environmental health and safety platforms, internal spreadsheets. There are lots of different solutions, and there still are, which can do the basics of carbon data collection. Now, firms are really grappling with the question of how do I build a dedicated carbon management infrastructure which can support these overarching organizational goals. So this chart, I guess, is my attempt at making a bit of a maturity curve outlining the situation. So we have the old school compliance here from a decarbonisation perspective. Essentially, make a net zero goal that's not too far out what your competitors are doing. And then, you're probably good to go in your press releases. The next stage for some more advanced firms, stakeholder alignment. Not only do you have to implement a net zero goal, you need to start building a program to achieve that. And not only does it need to meet sort of basic marketing requirements, it needs to meet what your customers expect. A good example of this, lots of oil and gas companies coming under sort of legal pressure to stop saying 2050 is when we're going to start decarbonizing. And people also want to see decarbonization framed in both risks and opportunities. And that's a core part of the TCFD. And all of these regulations, CSRD, SEC, and voluntary frameworks like ISSB, which are fundamentally built on the groundwork of the TCFD. Competitive advantage. Well, if you want to be seen as a leader in this, like Amazon, Walmart, Microsoft, and others, you essentially need to prove your net zero performance. You need to improve it and then prove it. And that's how you're going to win business, by being a low carbon provider, or at least not being excluded for poor performance on that. Sustainable world. I don't think very many firms have hit this bucket yet. But essentially, it's about continued operation in a net zero framework, being able to balance profitability and ongoing business viability with the needs of decarbonization and the environment.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Eventually, getting to that sustainable world is probably the realm of very few that are at least trying to get there. A couple of companies that come to my mind, Connor, is like Allbirds, which is a shoe company that produces shoes that actually, for each box that you buy, there is a carbon footprint on the sole of the shoe or on the box of the shoe that you buy itself. And they just are about to release a completely net zero shoe. So that's awesome. Patagonia is another company that comes to my mind, the apparel maker. They're really trying to really embrace this sustainable world concept, where it's not just for compliance, not just for what the stakeholders are asking or achieving that competitive advantage. It is that more altruistic while staying viable goal that they're trying to embrace.
Fantastic. Yeah, Patagonia is a great example. And another one I like to do is firms like Ørsted, the big Danish energy company, right? Demonstrating leadership, showing how you can decarbonize energy supply.
Right.
So this is a fairly complicated slide, but essentially what I was trying to do was to show the utility of carbon management software. Why do you need to digitize these processes? And the fundamental reason is carbon related data, whether that's activity data, how far did an employee drive, or is it spend data, how much did we spend on raw materials with a certain supplier, or is it energy consumption, how much buildings, how much power is being used in our buildings and heating, cooling, etc., etc. Carbon management requires a complicated system of taking this basic data, running it through carbon accounting frameworks, the most famous of which is the GHG protocol, but that's changing as well, and then using that for operational improvement. I have 3 buckets at the top demonstrated by the dark blue boxes. Climate risk and carbon disclosure. That's essentially, how do we prove performance? Carbon financial management. How do we reconcile decarbonization with operations, right? Because obviously there's a cost involved in shifting energy, for example, and carbon operational management. And at a practical level, at everyday business decisions, how do we embed decarbonization in our processes? Now, what carbon management software tries to do is to eliminate the errors within this process. You can imagine, taking Excel files and putting them through every single step. Every firm should be doing that. They haven't implemented software, but it's clearly a very manual process. And ultimately, the end goal of carbon management software is to help you actually use your carbon performance data to make tactical decisions. When should we set our net zero target date? When should we anticipate rolling out offsets or investing in renewables? And that's the end goal of carbon management software. Another fairly complicated slide, but I think it demonstrates perhaps the difficulty that firms do face in doing this. There's essentially 4 different elements of carbon management. There's data collection, and you can see by the sort of tan color the number of repositories in which this data is held. Operational data, it's your facilities, travel, energy usage. Depending on your industry, perhaps it's the impact of your assets. In something like cement, that's absolutely huge. Product level data, your manufacturing processes, supplier emissions data, What's your supply chain doing? And these are all held in disparate platforms, right? No firm is using one overarching ERP to manage everything. What carbon management allows you to do is to automate the data transfer and create a carbon data repository. And that's the second part of this, data aggregation and management. Is the data that's coming in accurate? How do I apply emissions factors to this? How do I apply supplier specific data to this? How do I ensure my carbon accounting, that process of taking basic, well, not basic, but business relevant data and putting it into a carbon footprint? How can that be done properly? Once you have your carbon footprint, there are obviously more use cases, but I'll keep it for two for this. Two use cases for that. Emissions reporting. Okay, you've made improvements, you understand your footprint, perhaps you've reduced it year on year. Well, now you have to communicate that to regulators, stakeholders. You have to put your carbon footprint on the box of shoes if you're Patagonia. And net zero program management. This is that recurring process of improving year after year, understanding where are my emissions hotspots. Am I aligned with my overarching decarbonization targets? Where's my energy coming from under usage reporting, right? When should I tactically buy PPAs? Can I get on-site PPAs? So these demonstrate the different purposes behind carbon management, and it shows with the little blue boxes from a process perspective where carbon management software helps. And I hope this indicates perhaps the complexity of the situation and why digital investment, not just in carbon management, but also in other adjacent management platforms, your buildings management platform, your financial data and reporting is so necessary.
I really like this picture because it kind of highlights that we keep talking about data, but data by itself is not going to really make the big difference. Data is the lowest common denominator anymore. You need data, but you then also need to convert that data into actionable intelligence, which requires a little bit more of processing the data, creating workflows around the data, and making sure that the systems around it are able to give you that actionable intelligence, that hotspot analysis you talked about. I love that analogy there. So thank you for sharing that, Connor. Any other thoughts before we move off from the slide?
No other thoughts for me. I'm sure I'll refer back to some of these concepts in some of the later slides. I guess one thing for me that's actually thinking about it, we should talk about is that this gives a very overarching picture, and it's sort of designed to show you everything that could possibly go into carbon management, right? This is scopes 1, 2, and 3 across 10 different things that I was thinking about. From a business perspective, the vast majority of data and performance relating to carbon you actually have control over is scope 1 and 2. I put that under operational data, under the data source column there. And the vast majority of high quality data that it's even possible to collect and improve performance-wise is scope 1 and 2. The reason for that, there's a great example last year. I looked into Microsoft's CDP report, and it said its scope 3 emissions for sold product energy usage had tripled that year. And the reason for that is it was locked down and people were playing their Xboxes. And I like to use that as an example of stakeholders don't expect you to have a fully decarbonized supply chain, whatever that means, and sort of have perfect control over your scope 3 emissions. What they do expect you to do is to control everything under your control and to put in action plans and decarbonization processes for what you can control. And in reality, the methodologies behind carbon accounting only really support accurate accounting for scope 1 and 2. Now, that doesn't mean you should take scope 3 as sort of something you don't need to do. It's definitely something everyone should be aware of and use it on their, for example, procurement decisions. But what you actually mostly have control over is your scope 1 and 2, your operational assets and performance. And this is the reason why the SEC is sort of a bit wary of trying to regulate scope 3 emissions, because it's very difficult. It's fundamentally the double counting emissions. Your scope 3 emissions is always someone else's scope 1 and 2. So the market hasn't really come up with a way to accurately deal with that sort of thought paradox. So just some additional thoughts from me.
Yeah, no, that's very, very valuable. And kind of goes to that old saying, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. If this is too complicated, too much, well, start where you can and start making progress towards your measurement so you can actually manage your operations. Very insightful. Thank you. So moving on, just like some of the data that Connor just shared with us that they had collected through Verdantix, recently we at Energy Cap have a group of Energy Cap users that we call Eco Champions. They are a group that come together periodically to share best ideas and collaborate on pain points that they are facing. We did a survey with them, State of Decarbonization. So I'm going to jump into a little bit of what we found based on the survey results. Talk about the executive summary and some key data findings. So just as a high level, the results that we're going to see are from 100 plus organizations. 75% of the organizations respondents identify themselves as energy and sustainability professionals in all of these various categories of industries. So at a very high level, over half of the respondents have set decarbonization goals or their organizations have set decarbonization goals. Viability, meaning business viability and continuity and compliance are the primary drivers for them. However, we also found that data access is the number one challenge in decarbonization, especially that scope 1 and 2 that Connor was talking about earlier. That has become a priority for reporting. And then they're looking at this whole energy evolution in terms of efficiency, potential electrification, and then how do we enable those renewables so we can at least evolve our energy usage. Diving a little more deeper, we talked about earlier that the survey found that most of the respondents felt data access is the number one challenge. Here's the details behind that particular data point. So we asked our respondents to rank which of these categories represent the biggest challenge. And the biggest challenge, again, is access to that relevant and accurate data for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So Connor was just sharing the details behind each of those elements that go into what makes scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions data possible. And seems like, Connor, your results are aligning very well with the survey that we just did, is having access to that data. When it comes to the maturity, the way we see it, whether you are doing just annual data collection, carbon reporting, and maybe going down to monthly or even real time, most organizations are at a low level of their data journey. The big thing, though, as Connor pointed out earlier, is there is this continuum where you can also see there is some types of data that's easier to measure because, for example, in energy, you have meters. Most utilities have installed meters, so it's reasonably easy to measure what that data is. And it's very easily available because everybody gets a utility bill. So some of the things that are to the top right are in the scope 1 and 2 area, so it's much more available and much easier to measure. Whereas those that are on the bottom left are those scope 3 type scope 3 type emission data that gets a little harder to measure, and even if it is measurable, it's not as easily available. So again, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Try to identify and collect the data that supports your organizational goals and reporting needs, and focus on those that are at least available and make progress. The other thing we asked about in our survey was how easy it is to calculate what are the respondents doing right now when it comes to measuring their emissions. What we have found also, again, I guess, solidifying what Connor was saying earlier, is most of them, more than half of them, are able to calculate and report on those scope 1 and 2 emissions. Whereas if you look at the scope 3, it's almost at the bottom there, where less than 17% are able to do that reporting. I'll turn it over to you, Connor. What do you think of this? Does this align with your findings?
Yes, definitely. I think it really shows, I guess. I mean, for me, the most interesting thing here is big priority to engage, right? But they're still finding it hard to collect all the data. I often, if we take sort of the red and the green or yellow at the bottom, I often find that the big blocker to scope 3 emissions, right, is the fact that smaller companies in your supply chain might not have the bandwidth, the understanding, the internal expertise to understand their own emissions footprint. So this really shows the importance for engagement across the supply chain. I mean, it's one big trend in the market right now, for example, is sort of supply chain investment in renewable energy. You'll see this a lot in manufacturing, paying your supply chain, giving them, for example, renewable energy sources, battery storage, etc., on-site energy generation, to help improve their own emissions and reduce your scope 3. I think also on the calculating and reporting scope 1 and 2, for me, that shows that firms are very much aware of of what's coming down the regulatory pipeline. Maybe a lot of these respondents are in New York. There's is it local law 97, I think, off the top of my head, again requires this. In the UK, required. So it shows to me that the sort of the balance of priority is in the right place in terms of what firms can actually do to reduce emissions.
Right.
So on that, we asked a similar question. We wanted to understand how firms are prioritizing decarbonisation initiatives. As you can see, we gave them quite a few answers here, and I just want to focus on the top 3. The first one, product carbon footprint reductions. This is really tying into the using decarbonisation for commercial gain, right? Decarbonisation doesn't just have to be sort of virtuous action from a business perspective. As the economy decarbonizes, vendors which are most aligned and congruent with that direction will be best placed for ongoing business viability, which was one of the top findings of your guys' survey. So that's number 1. Number 2, building energy efficiency. The reason why I think building energy efficiency is so high here is obviously, there's a real estate footprint associated with many industries. It's almost an industry agnostic decarbonisation issue. It also shows that efficiency and emissions reduction is the number 1 key to all of this. Currently, there's not enough renewable energy on the market for everyone to purchase PPAs, which are physically linked to their assets, right? You can buy sort of virtual PPAs and this and that, but really energy efficiency is the name of the game. Not only does that reduce your emissions through reducing energy usage, it also reduces costs, right? You're essentially improving your business performance and your environmental performance. So those two don't have to be separated. And then supply chain emissions reductions at 3rd. As we go down, I think a lot of those become relatively industry specific, but the top 3 are sort of industry agnostic. An interesting one to note, considering the carbon markets at the moment, buying carbon offsets is at the bottom there. That's very much the old paradigm for decarbonisation. For example, Sky, I think, claimed carbon neutrality since 2008. In 2008, it was carbon neutral through offsets, but expectations have shifted. I think there's a understanding of carbon offsets in many ways as sort of climate indulgences, right? You're paying off your sins in emissions. And while firms can still tactically use carbon offsets, it's not the primary decarbonisation lever to hit net zero in sort of the modern net zero paradigm.
Right. That's very fair. And then the other question that the eco champions were asked was, so what are the strategies you're using? Is it efficiency, electrification, renewable? So Connor, you just mentioned how the efficiency is number 1. I mean, being a big proponent of this old fact that the last kilowatt hour you didn't consume never had to be generated, never had to be transmitted or stored. So whatever we can do to reduce our energy usage, energy consumption will go a long way. Electrification is another one which is become a big item. I mean, San Francisco, for example, currently does not allow, except for very, very, very specific cases, a natural gas line run to a new property that's being constructed right now. So electrification is becoming big, and the reason is because the electricity is one of those few sources of energy that is much easier to produce using renewable energy, whether it's on-site or off-site. But that's where then, if you can't do the top three items, on-site, renewables, electrification, energy efficiency, that's where, to quote you, Connor, paying for your sins through these purchase power agreements or renewable energy credits or other offsets that you can engage in kind of comes into play, because you kind of have done what you can do, what you have control over in those top three elements. And outside of that, you're now relying on the market to help you achieve, at least on paper, the goals that you want to achieve. Thoughts on the results here? Does this resonate with what you're finding through Verdantix?
Definitely. I guess it's very aligned for me. I think also what this sort of demonstrates as well is that to be optimistic about decarbonization, right? We think about electrification, we think about scope 2 in general. Nationwide, or at least in more developed economies, grids are becoming greener, right? Everyone's scope 2 emissions are coming down. But what it's about is beating the curve, right? Not sort of just relying on that gradual decarbonization. And I think also with PPAs, RECs, etc., I think this is where some of the challenge of reconciling decarbonization with business performance comes into fruition, because it's not possible, as you say, in every instance to procure renewable energy, or perhaps to generate all your renewables on site. You know, there are lots of industries and locations where that's just not feasible. I know in the US, for example, there's a lot lower percentage of sort of renewable energy generation than, for example, in the EU. So renewable energy credits and even purchasing offsets, you know, are a valuable tool in the toolbox for decarbonizing those emissions that you can't otherwise reduce yourself. I think the SBTI calls it sort of, I can't remember the word now, but the emissions you can't directly reduce, it's okay to offset those. So
right.
Unabatable.
Right.
And so this slide essentially is tying back some of these overarching initiatives to the digital aspect of this. I think for me, it's very heartening to see facility level emissions data acquisition tools at the second one there. That is essentially what you need to do to prove energy efficiency, to improve it, to report on your assets, on how they're actually performing. Voluntary carbon reporting at the top, it's still playing a pivotal role, as it will do, you know, for the foreseeable future. I think voluntary carbon reporting is becoming a way for firms to demonstrate extra performance, right? There are lots of ways of improving your societal and social impact that's not necessarily appropriate for regulated disclosure. You know, one of my bets is that scope 3 becomes something which is voluntarily reported and judged, and people still care about, but it's not reported on or audited perhaps in that perspective.
Right.
But firms, I think, are still having a lot of difficulties with a lot of the net zero related program management stuff. That's really sort of the next frontier. I think another thing that I always like to look at is the sort of this split of, let's say, the good priorities and the low priorities, or what's high and what's low. I mean, if you summed up the sort of very high, even that, you know, you have a lot of these hitting that 50% mark. If you add in moderate priorities, you know, the bar is all the way to the right. So there's a lot of action being done.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so in a different way of looking at it, it's your journey to decarbonization. How are you going to do? How are you going to achieve the decarbonization goal that you have set for your operation? There are so many tactics that you're using. So this is an illustration of how, if you had a previous year emission in the leftmost bar chart and your business grew, odds are your emissions grew as well, because you'll probably need more raw material, you'll probably have more travel, you'll probably have more employees, whatever the case may be. And then the tactics that you're going to use, the first one is that energy efficiency tactic, the electrification, the PPA is renewable. And again, we are going from left to right in terms of some kind of prioritization, where make sure you're doing energy efficiency projects first before you go with the offsets to the extreme right. So You do all the hard work. How do you prove that you did it? Or how do you tell your story in terms of making sure that it's viable and it's provable, relying on data and information? So this is where we bring technology to the rescue, and Connor was talking about this earlier. I want to draw a parallel to what happened to accounting systems. So if you go back even 20, 30 years, most of the accounting systems, financial reporting used to be done in paper ledgers. And what used to happen with paper ledgers is it was difficult to access data. It was a lot of manual labor, hard to maintain and update because it was sitting in somebody's shelf or somebody's desk drawers, high chance of error. And then the data was limited to the ledger owners. So the ledger owners had the full control of that. Well, where we are today is we have a lot of ERP systems like SAP, Workday, many others, where now we are recording that information electronically, more accurate, real time, and all of these benefits that you see from having that financial system. Nobody does their books with pen and paper anymore. Even taxes, back in the day when you used to do taxes by hand, anymore we use software to do that. That's the same evolution that we are going to have for sustainability reporting, especially when it comes to those scope 1 and scope 2, where we used to have those paper utility bills or manually read meters and having all that data collated in some kind of spreadsheets or data silos. Well, where we are moving is through systems that we are coining energy and sustainability ERP systems that allow you to collect that data automatically, audit that information that's coming in, so you can have those eliminating so that you can reduce your errors and eliminate that manual labor. So that's really where the world is moving because of all the reasons that we talked about earlier, the compliance reasons, the making the world a better place reasons. This is a similar chart that Connor had earlier, where all those different disparate pieces of information are coming into the ERP system. One thing I like to think about when I see this chart is it's almost like the utility team in your organization can speak a certain language, but the transportation team speaks a completely different language. So if you are the sustainability leader in your organization, you almost need to learn multiple languages if you want to collaborate with them. That is, if you don't have a system that can do that for you. So without the system, the utility folks are going to talk KBTUs. Without the system, transportation folks are going to talk miles driven. Well, if you have a system that is able to accept the data in the language that your subject matter experts are speaking, then as a sustainability professional, you just accept the data in the form they're giving it to you, and the system will do the translations and allow you to report on the data that you need to report on. And to that effect, EnergyCap is proud to have a suite of software which allows you to do your scope 1, scope 2 data collection and the utility management. We also have a smart analytics platform that allows you to analyze real-time data to make sure that you identify any issues that before they become significant issues. And then, of course, we have the financial grade greenhouse gas accounting system called Carbon Hub that allows you to also do your tracking and target emissions reduction. So that's at a high level what our software is capable of doing. We want to make sure that we serve the energy and sustainability professionals of the world and hopefully make the world a better place. With that, we have reached the end of our prepared content. At this time, I am going to look at Q&A. So far, there are a few questions that have come in. I will read them out loud, and please throw more questions in the Q&A when you can. So Connor,
Yes,
one
please keep me on
question.
my toes, respondents. I love some
Yeah,
challenging ones. I'm sure you guys have got some.
right. So one of the questions, it's a really good question, is what sets apart an average decarbonization strategy from a great one? That's a great question.
Yeah, so I think this really hinges on the notion of a transition plan. This sort of comes back to financial planning post '08, right? '08, there's a big there's a big mortgage related crash. I don't know if you guys have seen The Big Short, and regulators started demanding banks plan for these butterfly events, these black swan events. Transition plans are essentially the same thing. How is your business going to transition as the economy decarbonizes? How will your products, your businesses, your services, your employee retention, your hiring, your role in supply chains change in the face of increasing compliance requirements, stakeholder expectations, and litigation? So I think firms which are looking to differentiate, it's about taking your decarbonization plan. Let's say you want to reduce your scope 1, 2 emissions by 30% and integrating with that within your overall business viability plan. How does that decarbonization effort impact, for example, your asset investment or divestment plans? How does it impact fundraising? And that's really the key, because stakeholders want to see that decarbonization is being treated as a fundamental business issue and not as a pure sort of old school CSR reporting. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about net zero, modern day decarbonization, it's not just about reporting what your impact is, it's about reducing it. But reducing it requires financial investment and cost. So showing that your plan covers both those bases, I think that's really the key. And it's going to be required by regulations anyhow at some point. So
Yeah. Well, there's an actually related question. So one of the most challenging processes that have been seen in companies, although wanting to reduce their carbon footprint, they're still stuck on ROI of decision making. Do we have suggestions on how to move forward with a proposal while balancing the ROI is what I'm assuming the question is driving towards.
yeah, definitely a challenging question, that one, because I guess a lot depends on your business operations and sort of the segments you're in. I think it's about realizing that being an improved, having an improved emissions profile is a commercial benefit, because you're going to be preferentially treated by your major suppliers. If you're, perhaps a smaller business, if you're a larger business, it's going to reflect in, let's say, your financial performance, your stock prices potentially, although looking at that link can be a bit challenging. And ultimately, from a pure bottom line perspective, you're going to have to report on this. Investors, market participants will see your performance. So it's much better to get ahead of the curve and dodge compliance fees and get a plan in place than it is to sort of scramble. In the UK, they just did their first TCFD reports. And I think you can definitely read them yourselves and see where people only realize how to report on this in 12 months' time, the difference in quality, the difference in granularity, and the difference in impact.
Yeah. And then there are some carbon taxes that can also be taken into account. And I know different jurisdictions are coming up with a different number, for lack of a better word, in terms of what they are valuing carbon at. I know Canada has a different number than US than Europe. So just an advice to the person who asked the question, you can possibly incorporate that into the ROI calculation, that if we don't do this, we will be facing those actual dollar penalties or euro penalties. Great.
Canada is a great example, because the whole transportation industry in Canada is predicated on long distance trucking and hauling. And in 5 years' time, the carbon tax is going to be greater than the cost of fossil fuels. So for those businesses, it's a pure business viability question there.
Right. No, that's great. One other question is, what are some key considerations that buyers should make when selecting a carbon management software?
I think for me, the most important thing is level of industry experience of your provider. And that's from a pure sort of tactical view, in that implementation will be more straightforward. The workflow structure will be more straightforward. The emissions factors which are present in the platform for you to do your carbon accounting will be more straightforward. I think carbon accounting is moving towards a very industry specific model. It doesn't make much sense to compare an oil and gas firm to a consultancy firm, right? The whole mechanisms of carbon accounting is moving towards industries establishing their own sort of best practices and leadership and industry competition rather than inter-industry competition. You can already see sort of battles. A good example of this is Microsoft, AWS, or the cloud hosting sites. They are fighting to prove that they have got the best energy performance, the lowest carbon hosting. And that's what's going to take place. So I think selecting a platform which is really geared towards your industry can easily take in the data from platforms that everyone in your industry uses. That's really the ticket. If most of your emissions are associated with air travel and employee travel, like the big four, for example, or consultancy firms, accountancy firms, professional services, well, it makes sense to select a platform that's familiar with all of the big business travel expensing solutions and using that.
Yeah, that's great. Another question, I'm actually going to combine two questions. How should strategies for decarbonization vary by industry? And then there is another specific questions about lubricants industry.
So how should they vary by industry? So I think this is really the key when we're thinking about basically a lot of the stuff we've covered today. And I mentioned transition plans, right? And the rise of industry specificity. Decarbonization potential varies wildly by industry. At the bottom, let's put cement, aerospace, and fossil fuel extraction, right? These industries are fundamentally emissions intensive. The decarbonization potential is fairly low. So how should those industries react? Well, it's about leveraging innovative technologies and understanding how those can impact your decarbonization pathway. A good example of this is direct air carbon capture. I can't remember how many billions the US government has pledged to invest in this. Cement producers have been putting, direct air carbon capture and storage or utilization processes in their plants for decades. So you really need to understand the role of technology. If you're in an industry which is very easily decarbonizing or has very low potential, very high potential to do it, well, then you focus on the easy wins, and then you're in a good position to start tackling the scope 3 and to operate more readily as a member of a decarbonized economy. So it's very industry specific. And I think one of the most important things to recognize is that because decarbonization is so industry specific, in many ways, it is these leaders in the industry which is determining how the rest of the industry decarbonizes. I'm sure you can Google studies on decarbonization potential in maritime, right? And you'll see AP Moller Maersk having blue hydrogen powering their ships or things like this. So it's a real opportunity there for each industry to take the step up and for individual firms to compete with their peers. Because ultimately, it does have to come back to ROI, right? No one's going to do this out of the good of the hearts, totally. So being able to leverage that competitive advantage you can gain by being a low carbon supplier, having the lowest carbon shipping, opening like Nutrien was planning to do a low carbon fertilizer plant, then it's a no-brainer.
Yeah, that makes
And the
sense.
second part for lubricants, I'm not particularly familiar with lubricants beyond the fact that they're obviously made from petroleum products and byproducts of the sort of fractional distillation. So I can't go too much into that, but I would imagine as, let's say, a hard to decarbonize industry, it's going to be about leveraging innovative technologies. It's going to be about, in this case, actually investing in high quality carbon offsets and essentially doing the best you can until technology catches up. That technology gap is there. The lubricants industry will always exist and it will require fossil fuels. It's not about being net zero. It's about being the most decarbonized out of your peers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was going to also add that GHGprotocol.org is a great resource. It has some industry specific guidelines. So you can go to that resource. I don't know if they have lubricant specific, but at least they have manufacturing specific. So you can apply those to your industry. And second, I would say start measuring. You cannot manage what you don't measure. So make sure that you have an idea. If you're going to do it through offsets, how much to offset has to be a question that you have to answer before you start going and buying carbon offsets. So I would say start with making sure that you know what your carbon footprint is before how to mitigate it. Another question that has come in is many people incorporate social cost of carbon in decision making as another data point. What has been your experience with that?
I have to say I'm not quite familiar with what social cost of carbon is, or perhaps I've been using a different term. If you can provide, I guess, a clarification on this. I mean, the biggest issue I've seen here is with these direct air carbon capture plants and the equation between social impact and carbon performance. If that's what you mean, then we can we can have a discussion of that. But
Well, I can. We have 4 more minutes, so I'll give Robert Stanton, my friend at University of California System, an opportunity if he wants to clarify. Back in the day when I used to work at University of Nebraska, I used to actually talk in that. Maybe it is the same thing that Robert is asking. Is how can we put value on what the prospective students are thinking in terms of making their decision on which university they want to attend, because not having that tuition input as a revenue is an impact to your bottom line if you're a university. So how do you incorporate that social cost of their decision making to attend my university versus another university that's actually providing the carbon footprint information, whereas my university may not be providing it? I'm thinking that's what he's getting at, and that's how I used to think when I was at the university. If I could just produce some kind of a metric that says this is our carbon footprint per credit hour that we teach, that would probably go into that ROI or decision making calculation to do the math. Robert, feel free to add that clarification if there is one. Otherwise, for now, we'll move to one more question, maybe. It's a very vague question, and I know that you don't have a crystal ball there handy, Connor. But any insight into what SEC is probably going to do with Scope 1, 2 versus Scope 3 requirements?
yeah, so I think scope 1 and 2 is pretty much a no-brainer. I think scope 3, they're gonna delay the scope 3 element or not include it, or ask you to include it and not include assurance over that. I think methodologically it's absolutely impossible to, I guess, properly understand your scope 3. For those of you familiar with the GHG protocol, you can do it activity based, you can do it spend based, you can do it multiple different ways. They all have massive mathematical accounting problems with them. So I think scope 1 and 2 will be the answer with that. I don't see, this is a question I've been grappling with a lot because it has big ramifications on the market as a whole. I'm a bit of a naysayer sometimes. I don't see how scope 3 is going to be required to a great degree of quality. What other industries have done, the EU CBAM, for example, they pick for like the top 10 suppliers or top suppliers by revenue, or for example, suppliers which give you precursor materials. So if you're making steel beams, it's who gives you the steel ore. So they focus it tightly on the potentially the biggest emissions sources. That I think is another possibility, but I think it'll take some time for them to codify that.
Yeah, that's where they get the biggest bang for their buck. Yep.
Mm.
Well, we are at time. I really appreciate everybody that stayed online and engaged with us. Thank you for those awesome questions that you throw in there. And thank you, Connor, for taking time off your busy day and probably late in the evening for you in London there and making time to attend this and participate. Really appreciate your insight and combining your experience with what we are finding and how the industry is moving. With that, thank you very much. Everybody have a good rest of your day, rest of your evening, and we will see you at a webinar another day.
Thank you very much, everyone.